Hello, and welcome to a look at David's Midnight Magic for the Commodore 64, a game that was released by Brotherborn, or Brotherborn, whatever you prefer to call them, and is quite obviously a pinball game. The title would probably make you think about something slightly different, and I'm not necessarily saying of a rude nature, but titles aside, it is the name of a pinball table, and when it comes to pinball, you are probably most likely either a pinball enthusiast or the average gamer who can take it or leave it. I'm more in the second category in that regard. But of course, proper pinball enthusiasts would most likely prefer to play the real thing rather than a computer version of the real thing. But then again, of course, if you don't necessarily have the money in order to buy a proper machine, or more likely not necessarily have the money to spend coins on every single pinball machine you ever come past. A home computer version of said game could, well, of course, be interesting. And even for the average gamer, pinball can still be very, very enjoyable. Now, if you look at this game, you have to bear in mind that it came out in 1984. It was one of the earlier, not earliest, but one of the earlier Commodore 64 games. And as such, it should be judged around that, or judged or whatever, looked at, rather, I would say, based on that time period. Because, of course, I think it's most people would be aware of pinball fantasies and pinball dreams. There are other pinball games from that era, but I consider those two to be the best of the computer pinball games made. And personally, I think that even though Pinball Fantasies had an awful lot of fluff, um, I think Dreams was the better game. But that's personal preference. Irrelevant. But it is relevant because it you have the knowledge of those two games. This game will very easily appear extremely basic, but if you remind yourself to 1984, when nothing else was available and the Pinball Dreams and Fantasies and whatever else they were called went even further off, and you happen to like a pinball games and you couldn't, based on earlier scenario, necessarily afford to pay the coins required to play the real thing, then this would have been a not a bad alternative. The rules of pinball applies. You have a ball, then you need to try and keep it in play by flipping it into various targets and loops and hoops and all sorts of things. And you have various activations that can activate extra bonuses, multiple points, multiple, and all sorts of other pinball-related mechanics. In that regard, the game is actually relatively faithful to the concept of pinball. Graphics-wise, it's not amazing. Let's not kid ourselves, but it's definitely not bad. Um, I have seen a handful of pinball games on the Commodore 64, which have been absolutely atrocious, both looking, playing, and sounding. And in that regard, well, at least from the graphical point of view, this game is definitely not bad at all. The sound is perhaps a bit too simple. There's not an awful lot of it, and whatever sound effects there are not necessarily standing out in any way, shape, or form. And of course, the game completely and utterly lacks any sort of soundtrack to keep you engaged, involved, entertained, besides playing the game itself. So, in that regard, it is very, very bare boned. The ball's movement, based on a number of games I played, I paid specific attention to how the ball behaves. And I'm not saying it's the case, but it feels a lot like the ball's movement is scripted. So basically, you can provoke the same movement of the ball depending on when you hit it with the flipper based on the speed of the ball. Of course, that will also be the case on a real machine to a certain point, but there will be some deviation because, of course, physics and all that stuff. As you can quite clearly see, if you don't touch the fibula, the ball will go exactly the same path all the way through to the exit every single time. That being said, though, if you find pinball remotely enjoyable, it's not a bad game. It can't measure up to later versions of pinball that was released, and it shouldn't have to be measured up against those kind of games because, of course, technology advanced, ideas evolved, and people became more and more creative and all sorts of things. So, in that regard, as a very, very basic pinball game, this is surprisingly enjoyable, surprisingly good. You can play this game 1 to 4 players. It is keyboard controlled. Thankfully, no one decided that we need to have this joystick control because that makes perfect sense for a pinball game. So, all in all, it's a pinball game. It's not a spectacular one, but it's definitely not a bad one either. And as such, I mean, what you see is what you get. Nothing more, nothing less. In that regard, I will say that I know this is probably going to be a video that is not necessarily going to interest anyone and everyone. But at the same time, with the amount of coverage I'm trying to do of Commodore 64 and Amiga, there will be the occasional oddball game like this one. It is just a natural thing because, of course, keeping consistent content means that if I was to go through only the great games, I would probably run out of content after about a week. On that note, thanks for watching. Take care. See you next time. Bye bye for now.